Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I see we still have a few more people logging in, but now that we've hit 4 o'clock, we're going to get started. First of all, if somebody just type in and let me know that you're all hearing me, that would be great. There is a little chat box down that you should see on your screen. Great, okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Just wanted to make sure everyone could hear me before we get started. My name is Melissa, and I work in the National Office for the National Ocean Sciences Bowl, and I'd like to welcome you to our second webinar of our Professional Development Webinar Series for educators this year. If you don't know about NOSB, I know we've advertised this a bit broadly this year. NOSB is a high school competition, academic competition, and the students are tested in their knowledge of everything related to ocean science. And each year for our regional and national competitions, we have a theme. Our theme this year is Our Changing Oceans, Science for Strong Coastal Communities. Basically, this is related to all the themes related around coastal resilience, which I think this year is probably our most timely theme given some of the major weather events and coastal flooding that we've seen, especially on the East Coast this past summer and fall. Today we're going to have a webinar on Living Shorelines, and just so you know, the basic agenda for the webinar is up to an hour-long presentation, and then we'll have 30 minutes for any questions that our participants and viewers may have. And so most of you saw that there's a little chat box. Feel free to type in your questions at any time during the webinar, but we will go over them at the end of the presentation. Just also, so you know, we've muted you all just in case there are any dogs barking or phones ringing so that we don't interfere with the participants. So again, just use the chat box for any other issues you may have. Okay, and then we will have this recording up on our YouTube station tomorrow. So if you'd like to share this with any other educators or your students on the team, feel free to. Like I said, we'll have that up tomorrow. And if you go search on YouTube, we're just the NOSB, and you'll find all our videos up there. So for this afternoon, I'd like to introduce our guest expert for the day. It's Dr. Carolyn Currin, and she's with NOAA's Beaufort Lab. She's actually in the location where we'll be holding finals this year near Morehead City, North Carolina. And today she's going to be speaking about living shorelines. So we can see her presentation is ready to go. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Carolyn.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today talking about living shorelines. As was said, I'm in Beaufort and the NOAA National Ocean Service Lab, which you can see in this picture, located right across about just a few miles away from Joel Fodry's Marines lab in Morehead City there, who spoke to you, I guess, earlier this fall. So I'm going to talk about living shorelines today, and I'm going to emphasize the why we want to have living shorelines, and we'll talk a little bit about what they are and where they can go. So what they are, you can see in this picture. This is the east side of Pivers Island where our lab is, and we had an erosion problem there, and we, instead of continuing the seawall, as you can see there's a seawall on either side, we decided to put in a salt marsh and oyster reef, and that's a submerged oyster reef offshore of the salt marsh. So this is a good example of a living shoreline where we used natural vegetation to try and slow shoreline erosion. Just a little bit more about where I am. I know I gather there's people from around the country on this call. We're located in eastern North Carolina, and one of the noteworthy things about eastern North Carolina, that top figure you can see, is it's very low-lying land, very flat topography. All that area in red there is less than 1.5 meters in elevation. Kind of zeroing in there, we're just south of Cape Hatteras and to the east near Cape Lookout. We are in an area which is also one of the NOAA Sentinel sites. It was picked because, among other things, we've got a lot of protected lands in this area. Really beautiful place to come visit. We've got National Park Service, Cape Lookout National Seashore. We've got a National Estuarine Research Reserve, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge. It's also home to a large Marine Corps base installation on the New River Estuary, Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. In addition to the NOAA lab and state labs, we also have 3 universities, University of North Carolina, NC State, and Duke all have labs in the area. So it's a really great area to do research. Again, another picture there on the bottom of Pybers Island. We're on the bottom end of that is the NOAA lab, and on the top end of the island there, or south end of the island, is Duke University. And we have a couple of living shorelines right here on the island. The one on the left there is the one I showed you in the first picture, oyster reef marsh living shoreline, and on the right there is a marsh sill that is on the Duke property. So what I'm going to do today is talk mostly, as I said, the why. Talk about fringing salt marshes, how they work, and why we want to use them for shoreline stabilization. Talk a little bit about erosion and sea level rise, especially relative to salt marshes. Show you the results of some studies on the effectiveness of the living shoreline approach to shoreline stabilization, and kind of weave through all this the idea that this is an approach that provides resilience for coastal communities. I just want to review a little bit about salt marsh structure and species distribution. This picture is of a salt marsh at high tide, so the water is up over the marsh and coming up close to the forest edge. Marshes occupy a narrow band of what we call the intertidal, between approximately mean high water, or the highest tide, and about mean sea level. And that distance, that range, varies. It's about 3 feet or a meter here locally. In places down South Carolina, Georgia, or up in the Northeast, it can be up to 2 or 3 feet. And of course, in the Gulf and other parts of our state, it can be only a foot or two in terms of the tidal amplitude. And so the combination of the range of the tide and the slope of the land really dictates how expansive the salt marshes can be, because they have to occupy that intertidal zone. And you don't see a lot of species in salt marshes, as we'll talk about in a minute, but changes in species distribution can follow really small changes in tidal elevations. Just a few inches can matter on what kind of salt marsh plant you get. What I've shown you here is the species typical of most of the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and we have different species of Spartina in the southern part of the West Coast. But Spartina alterniflora dominates the low marsh. As you get up into the high marsh, up until about high tide, you start seeing other species, Salicornia, also known as pickleweed, Spartina patens, also known as salt marsh hay, and then some other species as you get up in the higher marsh, Juncus and Disticulus. And so in that figure, you might have seen that I had really large plants drawn down there at the bottom of the tide and shorter plants as you get to the top. And that's because Spartina alterniflora stem height and density really vary across the marsh landscape. Here's a picture, and you can see off the distance there as you get close to the creek bank. We have much taller plants than in this marsh plain where we've got people standing, and in the foreground where the marshes are only, a foot or so in height. And so the tallest plants occupy the lower elevations. We get much shorter plants in the high marsh. And this is because this intertidal zone is a really stressful place to live. And the higher you are in the marsh, a little more stressful it gets. The problem with the marsh is that it's inundated by seawater, so it gets sulfate, which the marsh reduces to sulfide. So the sulfide concentrations in the marsh sediments can be really high. Also, because it's flooded so much, there's not enough oxygen. So this combination of low oxygen and high sulfide is really stressful, and there's not many plants that can live there. And Spartina forms a monospecific habitat because it's specially adapted to live in this intertidal zone and these stresses. And so, for example, Spartina has hollow stems, which helps with oxygen exchange. It can form a really large below-ground biomass, which helps it take up nutrients in this stressful environment, and as we'll see, also helps in terms of being providing shoreline stabilization. Spartina is able to excrete salt, and it also has a special photosynthetic metabolism, which allows it to retain fresh water and keep the salt out. So we don't have a lot of biodiversity in this marshes. So when we think about living shorelines, this is what can grow there. This is the plant and the plant community that's specially adapted to living right in that intertidal zone, which is a really stressful place for plants to occupy. Next thing I want to do is just introduce this term ecosystem services, again getting at why we want to put marshes along the shoreline. An ecosystem service is just a term that means these are the things that a habitat or a plant provides that we value. It may be that they help water quality, it may be fish and wildlife, fish and shellfish habitat, it may be recreational opportunities. But ecosystem service is a term you're going to hear a lot, and it just means the things that a habitat does that we as humans value. So what are some of these functions or ecosystem services that a marsh provides? Well, the first, as I've mentioned, is habitat. Not only do they provide, and most people are probably familiar with this, but they provide habitat for fish and shellfish. There's a high rate of primary production, so a lot of plant material in the salt marsh. The marsh also provides refuge for fish and shellfish. In particular, the marsh serves as a nursery for estuarine-dependent fish, many of whom their juvenile life stage is the most crucial part of their life history, and that occurs in the estuary and in the salt marshes. Marshes, of course, also provide habitat and food for birds. Marshes also have hydrologic functions, and of particular interest to us is wave energy attenuation and storm surge reduction. As I mentioned, they also help water quality, they trap sediments, they remove pathogens, and they have an important nutrient cycling function, and especially in removing nitrogen from nutrient-sensitive waters through the process of denitrification, and that takes place in the marsh sediment. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about wave attenuation. If we want a living shoreline, if we want to protect our shoreline from erosion, we want something that's going to be able to stand up to waves. And a number of studies have shown over the years that those stiff hollow stems of Spartina alterniflora and that large below-ground biomass that I referred to make Spartina very good at reducing wave energy and stabilizing the shoreline. 50% of incoming wave energy can be reduced within only 15 feet of the marsh. Marshes can attenuate over 90% of incoming wave energy in about 60 feet of marsh. The more above-ground plant biomass you have, the better they are at reducing wave energy. And that wave energy reduction decreases as the inundation depth exceeds canopy height. And that's an important point when we go from talking about wave attenuation to storm surge reduction. So in the bottom figure right now, I've got a salt marsh that's not underwater. This is low tide, and so the water is just at the bottom of the marsh. And so at this point, if there's waves in that water, the marsh, of course, isn't going to do much to attenuate that wave energy. And in fact, that's when you get erosion of that bare sediment in front of the marsh. However, when the tide comes in and covers the marsh, as we see in that top picture, now the marsh can be pretty effective at attenuating wave energy. This is the problem, and if you've got property landward of this marsh, this is what you want. You don't want that wave energy breaking on your lawn. You want the marsh to absorb it. The one thing that's important to note, which is that third point there, that if we have a storm surge, a really big hurricane or other kind of storm that pushes 5, 10, 15 feet of storm surge into an area, that water column is going to be so high above the marsh that the marsh no longer actually breaks the wave energy. It can still serve to slow the storm surge down. It becomes like a drag coefficient as the water moves across the marsh, but it doesn't really, it takes miles and miles of marsh to really slow that storm surge down. So everyday wave energy, marshes are really effective. Even a narrow bit of marsh can be really effective at everyday wave energy. Large storm surges, it takes miles and miles of marsh to really knock that storm surge down. So the next thing I want to do is show you a movie, hopefully this will work, of how effective a marsh can be at attenuating waves. So this is that same living shoreline that you saw in the very cover photo right here on the island. And this was a September storm, not a hurricane, just a big windstorm. And you can see the waves rolling into the marsh. You can see the marsh plants leaning back, getting flattened. If you look in the back of the marsh, though, you see those plants are pretty still. They knock that wave down in just 15, 20 feet of marsh. They're able to really effectively attenuate that wave energy. So the other thing I want to talk about, we talk about coastal resiliency, we talk about storms and waves, we also worry about sea level rise. How are we going to handle sea level rise? Can these habitats keep up with sea level rise? Are they going to drown? And in fact, salt marshes have evolved and developed in a period of sea level rise, and they have some feedback mechanisms that allow them to very effectively keep up with sea level rise. So on the left of this figure, or on the left rather, is a figure that kind of shows some of these feedback mechanisms. As the tide comes in and water rises, it brings in sediments and delivers them to the marsh. As the marsh attenuates all that wave energy, slows turbulence down, those sediments fall out of the water column and are deposited on the marsh surface. In addition, as the marsh is exposed to different levels of tides, it has this below-ground biomass, which can increase in volume. So between sediments coming in on top and this production of below-ground biomass on the bottom, the soil volume increases and the overall marsh elevation changes. And so, in fact, marshes can gain on the order of millimeters to even centimeters a year through this process and can keep up with sea level rise. A recent study by Don Cahoon looked at data all around the world and found that about 60% of salt marshes were adding elevation at a rate greater than local sea level rise. This other figure I've shown you here, this is a graph that shows you on the one axis the marsh primary production or marsh biomass on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is that elevation of the marsh surface across the intertidal zone. And so here you see mean sea levels about 0. And the optimal elevation for growth is a little bit higher than that. And this relationship between intertidal elevation and marsh biomass is this hump-banked or parabolic-shaped curve. And so at the low end, it's too stressful, and marshes can't make it because they're drowned too much. And at the other end, they actually can live at higher elevations. They just get out-competed by other plants. So there's this optimum elevation for growth, and where the marsh lands in this elevation is where it's going to make it. And so we want to keep our marshes to the right of this figure. We want to keep our marshes a little bit higher in that zone so that they can keep up with sea level rise. And the most crucial thing that we've learned that's important for marshes being able to keep up with sea level rise is how much sediment is in the system. Now, we've talked about how marshes have a really high rate of primary production, on the order of the same thing you would find in a cornfield, and they're really good at trapping sediments. And so we think about resiliency to global warming, we want to look at things where there's carbon sequestration, where the storage of carbon, the removal of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put into long-term storage in sediment. And marshes are really, really effective at that. On this graph, you see the number of CO2 equivalents, which is just a way of keeping track of carbon. There's a lot of ways of keeping track of carbon for a variety of habitats: grasses, salt marsh, mangroves, and tropical rainforests. And you can see that marshes are more effective than rainforests at sequestering carbon. And they do this, as we just reviewed. They have this below-ground biomass, and so they produce these roots. Over time, they trap sediments, increase their surface elevation. This below-ground root production gets buried. It doesn't decompose. It doesn't go away because it's anoxic down there. There's not enough oxygen, and so it stays for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. So this is an idea you may hear. It's an idea called blue carbon, and it's a really important function of salt marshes, helping to reduce the CO2 or greenhouse gases that we have in our atmosphere and locking them away in the sediment. So we've talked about a lot of ecological functions that salt marshes do and why we would want to incorporate them into our shoreline stabilization approach. And one thing I want to note in particular is that a lot of these functions occur especially at the marsh edge. Although for storm surge you might need miles and miles of marsh to be effective, many of the things that we're interested in occur especially at the marsh edge. So fish and shrimp are found primarily at the edge. Yes, they go all the way up into the marsh, but the highest densities are found at the edge. Wave attenuation, as I've showed you, a lot of wave attenuation occurs in just a narrow marsh. And similarly, most of the sediments that are trapped by the marsh happens right there at the marsh edge. So we have these really valuable habitats that do these wide variety of things that are of importance to us. And they also occupy this really beautiful estuarine setting where everybody wants to live. And so here we have a nice fringing salt marsh really doing all these great things we just talked about, and then people want to live right on top of it, sometimes literally right on top of it. And that causes a problem because marshes do erode, there is wave energy, and this conflict between people wanting to live on the marsh and the process of marsh erosion leads to I guess my slides got out of order here. I wanted to show you that where you have shoreline erosion and you have development, the marshes get squeezed out. So let's talk for a second about shoreline erosion and the factors that lead to that process. Basically, shorelines do erode, natural shorelines do erode. The main driver is wave energy, which is a function of fetch, or the distance across the open water that the wind is blowing. It's important what the predominant direction of winds are. And bathymetry, or the depth of water, is important as well. So much bigger waves, much greater wave energy is going to develop in deeper water than in shallow water. When we think about shoreline erosion and putting in living shorelines, we have to think about boat wakes, which in, for example, narrow channels like the Intercoastal Waterway, there may not be much wind wave energy there, but one of those large barges can produce waves that are higher than anything that would be produced in the open estuary from wind. The geomorphology is important, the slope, the elevation, the sediment type of the marsh, and of great importance, as we noticed, is shoreline type, whether it's vegetated versus sediment banks. Wherever people have looked, vegetated shorelines erode at a lower rate than do unvegetated or sediment bank shorelines. However, shorelines do erode. It's a natural process. Here are some published rates of shoreline erosion across North Carolina. From the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound, big open water in the northern part of the state, very shallow water, low tidal amplitude, but big fetches. And so we have almost a meter per year is the average rate of shoreline erosion in that part of the state. If you come down to the middle part of the state where the Neuse River is, has slightly reduced rates. And then a recent study we just did down here on the New River Estuary, which is surrounded by Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, we have about 30 centimeters, or a third of a meter per year. So marshes do erode, and we have this problem. So here we have an eroding shoreline, an eroding marsh. We have valuable coastal property, and people are not often content or able to allow that erosion to continue and threaten their property. And the traditional way of preventing shoreline erosion is to harden it primarily with a bulkhead, as you see here in the top figure. And over time, this has now resulted in, across the entire United States, 14% of estuarine shorelines are hardened. This is a result recently published this summer by a colleague, Rachel Gitman. 14% of estuarine shorelines in the U.S. are hardened. In North Carolina, there are over 800 miles of hardened shorelines. And so there's this real effort to develop some alternatives. Can we reduce erosion, minimize erosion, and still maintain all those ecosystem services that I described in the first part of the talk. And so we're interested in some alternative approaches, also known as living shorelines, that incorporate native vegetation, native habitats, and still provide some erosion protection. So why do we not want to have hardened shorelines? Let's first talk about that. So as we've mentioned, these tidal marshes have this continuum of vegetated marsh along the shoreline. They provide all this fish habitat. They have this shallow ramp topography. And one of the things I wanted to mention, I mentioned earlier how important in particular these marshes are for juvenile fish coming in from the ocean and growing up in the estuary. And one of the most important parts of that is just shallow water, where the small fish can go to get away from the big fish. When we put in a bulkhead, no longer do we have wave attenuation by the marsh. Now we have reflected waves. And so we get scour. We lose this shallow water, we lose this marsh habitat, and we lose this value shallow water refuge for juvenile fish. So even though the bulkhead is put in at the edge of the property, the bulkhead should be put in here at the top edge of the marsh. Even though it's put there, it has adverse impact seaward of where that bulkhead goes in. And we know from a variety of studies that we get scour, we lose sediment, we get a change in particle size, we lose the vegetation seaward of that bulkhead, we get a reduction in fauna, birds, and fish. Quite a number of studies have demonstrated that. And we reduce the capacity to remove biologically available nitrogen from the system. So where we can, we would like to come up with another approach than putting in a bulkhead to protect our property. Another problem with bulkheads is this idea of coastal squeeze. So I talked about salt marshes adding surface elevation to keep up with sea level rise, and that's one thing they do. The other way that marshes are going to be able to sustain themselves in an era of accelerated sea level rise is they're going to have to migrate landward. And over time this happens. If any of you have driven along the coast, you see what we see called ghost trees. You see trees standing in the existing marsh. And that's what's happened. Over time the marsh has migrated landward. However, when we put in seawalls or bulkheads, all of a sudden the habitat is squeezed. It's eroding, it's getting higher rates of sea level rise on the shoreward end, and it can't migrate landward. And so this is another issue with hardening as much of the shoreline as we have. We're not giving our marshes anywhere to go. So we want to get away from this hardened shoreline, this loss of habitat, this coastal squeeze, and we want to utilize living shoreline approaches. And I've got here a range of things that would fall under the term living shoreline, from just using marsh and oyster reef to maybe putting in a stone sill with the marsh behind it in a higher energy area, or maybe maintaining your marsh in front of a revetment or a bulkhead, or in a really high energy area. You would have, and I'm sorry, this is supposed to be an animated thing that was going to fly in, but this is a big breakwater system where you've almost got as much breakwater as you do salt marsh. And so the question we have as we try to promote this approach and have it used by coastal communities is understanding, are these living shorelines providing the same ecosystem services? Are they effective at maintaining the shoreline? And what kind of design should we be using? So I just want to go through a couple of studies that have been done that addresses those issues. The first is, are living shorelines providing the same amount of fish habitat as natural shorelines, and what happens when we harden shorelines? And so as I've said before, when we put in bulkheads, we completely lose this vegetated habitat, and we have much reduced numbers of fish and shellfish adjacent to bulkheads than we do in natural habitats. When we have a natural habitat and no bulkhead, we maintain this connection between perhaps seagrass or submerged aquatic vegetation in the subtidal. when we put in either granite or oyster reef, which sometimes will grow on the granite or can be used in place of the granite, we have just about equal rates of, or we do have equal abundances and diversity of fish in these marsh sills and marsh oyster reefs as we do in natural habitats. And there have been a number of studies, I've put a couple here, but there have been quite a number of studies that show that living shorelines are very effective at providing fish habitat. And sills function similar to natural fringing marshes and oyster reefs. Another thing we talked a little bit earlier was marshes keeping up with sea level rise. Well, how do living shorelines and how do this stone sill do in terms of keeping up with sea level rise? And one of the tools we use to track that is something called a surface elevation table, or a SET is the acronym. And this is a benchmark in the hereground. I show you in this red circle. This is all you see most of the time. And then you come out and you put this arm on it. And this enables you to measure very small changes in surface elevation of the marsh over time. And this bottom figure is another tool we use to track sediment accretion. I mentioned how effective those marshes are at trapping sediment. Here we have put that white layer is feldspar. We put a bright white layer of feldspar or pottery clay on the marsh. We come back a few months later and we can actually measure how much sediment has been trapped in that marsh. So in this study, we had 4 paired sites with sets at the lower end of the marsh and the higher end of these marsh sills. And with each one of these sites, we had a nearby natural reference marsh. And we ran these for a long time because these are really dynamic systems. And we wanted to get a long-term snapshot of how these natural reference marshes and how these living shorelines put in with these stone sills were going to function in terms of surface elevation change, sediment accretion, and how the vegetation would do behind these stone sills. I'm just going to summarize our results. After 9 years, we found in the natural marshes, actually the natural lower marshes have not done very well in terms of surface elevation. They've maintained their vegetation, but they've lost their surface elevation. The natural upper marshes have not had a significant change in their surface elevation. But there was a significant increase in surface elevation change in these living shorelines that had a low sill in front of them. This 3.4 millimeters per year is just about the rate of local sea level rise. So we found in our study that surface elevation increase was greater in sill marshes than the natural marshes at both the upper and lower edges of the marsh. We also looked at vegetation change. Now this is that same marsh I showed you earlier about 7 years later. And you can see how this marsh has grown all the way out to that stone sill. And you can also see at the upper end we've got a transition from Spartina into high marsh. And so we looked at vegetation and vegetation transects over a number of years. We looked at Spartina stem density, stem height, a whole number of parameters. But what I wanted to show you is what we found is that, and this graph shows you Spartina biomass in natural marsh in the green and in the marsh sills in the red. And we found in the natural marshes, although we had a change in surface elevation, the marsh vegetation was really stable over time in the natural marshes. And we were actually able to maintain the vegetation even at the lower edges. What we found in the marsh sills, as I just showed you, is there was an increase in marsh vegetation right at that lower edge. We had all that sediment accretion coming in, but we actually lost Spartina at the upper edges of those stone sill marshes. So this is the point. Increased sediment elevation was directly led to loss of the lower marsh habitat. It was replaced by high marsh. So one of the things people ask me, start talking about living shorelines, is, well, what happens when a hurricane comes? This is Hurricane Irene, came over North Carolina in 2011 and gave us an opportunity to address that question. Rachel Gitman did a study looking at these boxes are kind of in the wrong place. She didn't look at marshes out in the middle of the ocean. She looked at marshes up here along the Outer Banks. And she looked at marshes, and she also looked at bulkheads and found that the bulkheads, up to 75% of the bulkheads were damaged during the passage of Hurricane Irene. There was no loss in marsh elevation in any of the studies that she looked at. On Pivers Island, which is right here, we also looked at what happened to our bulkheads. We have riprap bulkheads and living shorelines around the island. What we found was that when the hurricane arrived, we actually added sediment. We had no erosion of the living shorelines on either side of the island. We did get scour behind the bulkhead, and we got scour behind the riprap. So overall, these living shorelines were very resilient to the passage of this hurricane and exhibited less damage than did bulkheads. Now, I put in the title, Where Can We Put Salt Marshes? So I thought I'd better put this slide in. And this really is one of the crucial questions for coastal resource managers and property owners, and that is, well, what wave energy conditions can I use a living shoreline instead of a bulkhead? So we did a study. We looked at marsh width in meters here in the y-axis and wave energy, which is was calculated using fetch, bathymetry, and prevailing winds. And we found that, not surprisingly, there's a strong relationship. The lower the wave energy, the wider the marshes are. And this provides us some guidelines. But we've also gone and looked at the wave energy of some existing living shoreline sites. And here's a very similar graph, although what I've done here now is all these vertical lines represent areas where stone sills are. And many of these stone sills, as you can see, were put in really low wave energy areas and probably were unnecessary. We've also found where we've used a combination of marsh oyster reef at some pretty high energy wave energy settings. So this dotted line here is the wave energy setting of this marsh oyster reef, which has been there for 20 years in about a 5-mile fetch and has been sustained throughout that time period despite the passage of numerous hurricanes. So we're starting to get some guidance, and we feel like we have some good recommendations on where you can use a living shoreline and what kind of living shoreline you might need. So here again we have our Pivers Island living shoreline, the early stages, later stages where the marsh has crept out over the stone sill. This is another example on Pine Knoll Shores. And we found that there's some trade-offs here. Sills replace subtidal habitat, so we're actually covering pretty important habitat here by putting these rocks down. The sills do increase sediment accretion rates, which is good for keeping up with sea level rise, but maybe it's not so good for maintaining our lower marsh and the fish habitat value. And we've also found that these structures, both with and without the stone sills, are resilient for storm impacts. And we've also been working hard at understanding, trying to minimize the amount of stone we add and finding conditions under which maybe we can use oysters instead. Oops, not sure what I did there. Okay, there we go. One of the places that we've really looked at trying to push the boundary a little bit to figure out how high energy of a site can we use just oysters in marsh without that stone sill is on the Rachel Carson Estuarine Research Reserve. This is the town of Beaufort here. This was a reserve that was eroding at several feet per year for a long time. And so we decided to try this oyster sill design in this really high energy site. And actually Joel Fodry put this sill in. He worked with us to make this, to design this. We put an oyster sill here, and we planted marsh behind it. And what we found over time is, again, despite a couple of hurricanes coming through, we've gotten a lot of sediment accretion behind that oyster sill, and we've also started to see the marsh reestablish itself. So this is probably about as high energy a site as you'd want to try this approach, but it looks like even here, this might be a viable alternative. So just to summarize, what I hope we've shown today is that salt marshes provide many valuable ecosystem services to coastal communities, and traditional shoreline hardening techniques such as bulkheads often result in a loss of these services. We've shown in particular that marsh vegetation effectively reduces waves, stabilizes sediments, and increases sedimentation rates. We found that marsh sills further increase sediment accretion rates and elevation gains than natural fringing marshes, but there are some trade-offs involved there, in that we change marsh vegetation and we lose some of that subtidal habitat in low marsh. we've also shown that oysters can be a viable addition in some areas to living shoreline designs. It's also worth pointing out in terms of coastal resilience that hardened structures like bulkheads and riprap don't have the ability to keep up with sea level rise. They don't provide the ecosystem services of these natural shorelines, and as we've seen, they may not perform as well during storms and hurricanes. And so we think that incorporating marsh and oyster reefs into a living shorelines approach to stabilization can result in cost-effective, sustainable shoreline protection. Thanks so much for attending. Be glad to answer questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Carolyn. Like I said, now is your chance, everybody, to use the little chat box and type in your questions, and then I will read them aloud to her so she can answer you. Okay, our first question is, so would the use of sills provide greater benefit in higher energy shorelines and submerged oyster reefs and marsh that are in low energy?
Generally, yes. There's some place in there where the oyster and the marsh may not be enough, and you might have to utilize a stone sill, yes.
What kind of maintenance is required for the sills?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not much. Sometimes, if you get a big storm, you might have to replant some plants, but that's a lot less expensive than trying to repair a bulkhead. So it's fairly low maintenance, and it's fairly inexpensive.
Next question is, what is the average cost of bulkheads versus the cost of living shorelines?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so there's a range. I think if you look in some of the handouts or materials I provided, like that weighing your options, for example, I think might have some very specific numbers. I think per linear foot, a living shoreline, well, the Pivers Island shoreline that I've talked a lot about didn't cost us anything. We used volunteers. We got the plants for free, which maybe not everybody can do, but plants are pretty cheap. They're about 30 to 50 cents a piece. But I would say on average, a living shoreline is going to cost in the order of $100 a linear foot, $50 to $100 a linear foot, and a bulkhead is going to be in the range of $250 up to $1,000 a linear foot. So much less upfront cost, just depending on the site and what exactly needs to go in.
Carolyn had mentioned 2 documents, so we uploaded those to our website. So if you go to our professional development webinar series page, either under the main page or her specific page, you'll see that there are links to 2 documents that she shares. So if you didn't read them before the presentation, make sure you check them out after.
Yeah, and I'll just comment that those documents are sort of geared towards homeowners who might ask questions such as these. And I'm going to put some of the primary scientific literature up there as well to address some of the more technical questions that might arise.
Another question came in asking, is dune grass considered a living shoreline, or is that more beach stabilization?
Yeah, that is beach stabilization. I should have mentioned. So, you know, my talk was really geared towards estuarine shorelines, but I think you could call that a living shoreline, but it would not be for estuarine shorelines, as you said. It would be for oceanfront beaches.
How close are you working with the Corps of Engineers since they are responsible for shorelines in the U.S.?
We work a lot with the Corps, and right now the Corps is in a process. And so I wasn't really sure how much to talk about this, but one of the real issues with living shorelines is the regulatory and permitting environment. In many states, it takes longer to get a permit for a living shoreline than it does a bulkhead. And that's a problem. A living shoreline, if you're putting that rock down, the Army Corps of Engineers views that as fill and doesn't like it. The Corps is right now in the process of trying to come up with what they call a nationwide permit that would ease the permitting of living shorelines. So yes, the scientific community, the environmental community, the state regulatory community are all working closely with the Army Corps of Engineers to address the permitting part of this problem. And that is a big, and when I say problem, I mean that we've got a whole lot more bulkheads than we have living shorelines.
The next question is, what effect do hard stabilization features other than bulkheads, so jetties, groins, breakwaters, have on living shorelines?
So jetties and groins have some of the same problems of a bulkhead in that you're not absorbing as much wave energy as you are reflecting it. So you're still getting scour, you're still filling, and they also have like a stone sill. You're removing that really valuable shallow subtidal habitat and filling it with rocks. One of the biggest problems with groins and jetties is you're also interrupting sediment transport. So if you're lying on the upward side of that, you might be gaining sediment and adding to your beach and might be really happy. But as I've mentioned, the sediment supply is crucial to the salt marshes. And so if you're intercepting sand and putting it on your beach, you're preventing it from going elsewhere.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? So feel free to type them in. Do you have a resource for what plants you would use in different conditions, given salinity, soil type, et cetera?
Yes, I think that might be part of that weighing your options. I can make sure I put one of those. I can make sure I make one of those available. Okay.
Another plant question. Other than Spartina, what other plants are important in the upper marsh?
So as you move into the upper marsh, you start getting the one that's used most that I'm familiar with is Spartina patens, also known as salt hay. So it's a really fine, much finer stem marsh, and is also very effective. Another plant that we find there is juncus. As you go into low salinity areas and brackish areas, juncus replaces Spartina at the shoreline. There's also another species of Spartina called Spartina sinusoides, which it actually grows almost twice the height of Spartina alterniflora. So all of these species can also be utilized in a living shoreline.
Any other questions? I'll ask, you were talking about the sets earlier. How expensive are they to create for the research?
So a set is essentially a benchmark, and putting the benchmark in maybe costs a couple $1,000s because it's stainless steel rod, and the arm itself is maybe another couple $1,000s. So it's fairly low investment, and the great thing about them is that you don't have to, you can go every 6 months or you can go every 6 years, and you can monitor that change in marsh surface. We just read a set here in North Carolina in a juncus marsh that had been established in 1992. We found that juncus marsh between 92 and 2015 was accreting at 2.8 millimeters per year throughout that 25, 26 years, which is almost exactly the rate of sea level rise at the Beaufort tide gauge. So sets are a really useful instrument. They've become used widely by federal agencies and universities to look at this issue of can coastal habitats, whether it's a mangrove, whether it's a salt marsh, can they keep up with sea level rise?
You mentioned a little earlier how some of these projects were more towards citizen science, getting locals involved. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
Getting involved?
Yeah, I wish I had talked about that a little bit more. So one of the things that I'm involved with, for example, is the Seeds to Shorelines program, which is run through sea grant, and involves including teachers from elementary through high school and their students actually germinating Spartina alterniflora in their classrooms and then planting them in living shoreline projects. I've worked a lot with some environmental groups, primarily for me, North Carolina Coastal Federation. We've also worked with Marine Corps Base, and it's just great to get people out there to see these plants, to have the hands-on, to have the reward of coming back years later and seeing, a really healthy marsh where it used to be a really eroded beach. So we do work a lot with nonprofit groups and the National Estuarine Research Reserve Education and Coastal Training Program to get people involved. I will say one of those references that I cited years ago, we had National Charity League and the local community college science class come out and actually get marsh vegetation measures. They used spike nets to look at fish use. And we actually published a paper with data collected by high school and community college students, and that was a really great thing to do.
Thanks. Any other last questions? Go ahead and type them in. Just a reminder again that we do have 2 of the documents Carolyn's talking about up on our website, and if she sends us any others, we'll be sure to get them up as well. And again, this has been recorded, so make sure you check it out on our YouTube station if you want to share it with your students. It looks like no other questions are going to come in, so people are saying thank you and asking you to keep up the interesting work. So we're going to finish our webinar for today. I want to thank Carolyn for presenting on this. I think the topic of living shorelines was obviously an interesting one, and as she mentioned, it's sort of a confluence of science and policy and dealing with bureaucracy and difficult items to discuss at times. So we hope you all enjoyed the presentation today, and we hope to have one more. We're sort of trying to confirm another speaker, but we'll let you know through Facebook and Twitter and our website if we have one more planned for this season on the topic of coastal resilience. So thanks again. Somebody just wrote in saying, sitting here in Colorado, she found this a very fascinating discussion. So thanks again, Carolyn.
Great. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.